Well, Sharon and Ike Miller, welcome to the Nothing is Wasted podcast. It's so fun to have you here.
It is so good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so this is a fun kind of, I love when worlds collide. So listeners, this might be interesting to you. I graduated with my master's degree at Wheaton, and Sharon, or Dr. Miller, I suppose I should call you, was Dr. Hodde Miller was one of my professors for a class, which was such a fun day. And I'll never forget, you talked about kind of women paving the way for other women and had that beautiful image of the not the ski, the sledders. Yeah. I'll never forget that. A lot of women in the class have continued to talk about that image. That was really strong.
Oh,
That's good.
I'm so glad.
Yeah,
that was such a dream. Like getting to teach like a whole lecture hall of women preparing for ministry.
So historic. I felt like it was part of this kind of holy, sacred, historic moment to be like all women in a room who were leaders in ministry. Mm-hmm. Unbelievable. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Ike, we're glad you're here too. So
good to be here. Absolutely. It is an honor. Absolutely.
Well, the two of you I know do. I mean, speaking of ministry, the two of you lead a church together. And so I would love to hear, before we dive, we're going to talk about your book, Sharon. We're going to talk about some of your stories, well, Ike, but I would just love to hear your story of leading together, how that even started. What's that been like? Where are you guys now? Just a story, a little bit about your life for us, if you will.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the planting, we started that process back in 2017, I guess. I was working at a church as a college and young adults pastor, but was kind of reaching that point of feeling like it was time for whatever God had next. And so I was feeling this sense of God calling us to do something together, but Sharon was not, and kept shutting that down.
Very well, by the way. Yes, that is relatable. Go ahead.
So, yes, to the point of like, do you just not want to do ministry with me? What's the deal? You know? But I think for her, she was writing. I was a pastor. We weren't really sure what that looked like. Yeah. And kind of the story goes, we were actually I was interviewing for a position at a church in Florida. And it was one of those middle of the night things where God kind of woke me up and said, I want you guys to go plant a church. And I was like, you're crazy. We're not doing that. Forget about it. But eventually I was like, okay, I need to at least tell Sharon, because if God starts doing crazy stuff, I need somebody to be like, hey, remember that whole thing? And
bear witness to this thing that God is doing. It's not
yes,
on my mind. Yeah,
exactly. Or shut it down. Yeah. Just be like, nope, we're not doing that. Nope, all right, good. I agree.
That is not the voice of the Lord. Absolutely not.
That's right.
Yeah.
But Sharon was like, okay, let's pray about it. And just crazy things started happening. We were praying for confirmation, and people would say things like, have you guys ever thought about planting a church?
Come on.
Or if you guys decide to plant, we'll help fund it in significant ways, which you're like, okay, people don't just say this stuff.
No, they don't just say that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that led to us planting in 2018 and here in Durham, North Carolina. So I don't know if you want to add more, share more.
Yeah, and then in terms of us leading together, I had never dreamed about being a pastor. Mm-hmm. And when we planted, I had just had our third child, and I was writing my second book, and I was traveling and speaking. And so just capacity-wise, I wasn't sure if I could commit to being a pastor. I felt like that came with expectations, responsibilities. But we are in a highly educated area. We're actually in one of the most highly educated areas in the country, because we have Duke and UNC and NC State. And then also what's called the Research Triangle Park is here, which draws a lot of people, like pharmaceutical folks. And so women are leading here in every sector. They are professors, they are doctors, they are CEOs.
Yeah.
But you don't see that reflected in a lot of the churches around here.
Interesting.
And, I shared, one of the things I think I shared when I lectured at Wheaton was the importance of role models, that is one of the ways that women discern their calling is by seeing other women. And this isn't just true for ministry. This is a lot of the literature on this is in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math.
Wow.
And so that is an act of stewardship. Like whenever a woman, person of color, person on the margins, whatever, is using their gifts in like a leadership capacity, that is just good stewardship of the body of Christ. And so Ike sort of used my research against me, and he said, he was like, you know, we really need to be a good steward of the women that are going to be coming to our church and teaching them how to use their leadership gifts for the kingdom of God. And so we initially decided I was going to have a teaching pastor role, which was going to limit the scope of my responsibility at the church.
Yeah.
But since then, we've actually transitioned back to a lead pastor, not just because my bandwidth has changed, but also him being my boss was like
Didn't
not
work.
No,
good.
that does
Not
not
fun.
work. Yeah.
Not good
It's
for
not good.
Nope.
and I think it was worse
Yeah.
for you, actually.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Really?
For some
It was
reason.
definitely.
Yeah,
oh,
it doesn't like, I don't know why. It just
Well,
kind of sucks
I know
all
why.
the romance
I can tell
out.
you why. It was.
I want to hear.
You know-
I want to hear more about this, mostly for my own investigation. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, so the tension that developed is we were trying to make it streamlined for our team so they didn't feel like, okay, do I have two bosses? Do I have one boss?
Yes.
You know, and how does that work? Who do I report to? Whose expectations am I meeting? And so Sharon and I would have this meeting once a week where we sat down and tried to get on the same page, made sure we were clear about where we were going, what we were doing. And then I was kind of leading our team. So then I would go and I would be, you know, managing our team, leading our team. But what would happen is we would have a conversation and it would be clear that there was something that was really important for Sharon. You know, something with worship
I had, like, a
or,
vision for
you
it.
know, something that was
Okay.
really important to her. But I knew on my end, that's going to mean I have to have a hard conversation with somebody on our staff.
Uh-huh.
And not that I'm afraid to have a hard conversation,
Yeah.
but it didn't matter enough to me. Like, I didn't feel like it was urgent enough
Uh-huh.
to kind of have this hard conversation to put the relationship on, you know, on rough terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then I'm in a place of, okay, do I have a hard conversation with Sharon where I say, hey, I don't think we should carry this out? Or do
Yeah.
I have a hard conversation with my staff that I
No.
don't want to have?
Right.
And I just realized, okay, we need to have a better kind of division of labor, and she needs to
Yeah.
be over the areas that she's passionate about, so
Good.
that if she wants to have that hard conversation about that thing that I
Right,
don't
just
care
got, like,
about,
delegating
she
to
can
you,
go
yeah.
for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it made it much better for us to be in charge of the things that we were most passionate about, that we cared the
That's
most
so good.
about,
Yeah.
and that kind of informed how we broke things down a little bit.
Yeah, but
so.
it was a lot of failing forward.
It's
a
been a
lot of
journey.
trial and error. We
Oh,
have
tell
not
me.
done this perfectly.
Well, it's also, I mean, we always mention this, but we also have a marriage counselor that we've met with for
Yeah.
10 plus years, and she has been a gift through all of this.
I tell you, our marriage therapist is, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Like, we'll just call her and be like, we cannot get through this moment right now. Because you
Yes.
do, when you're leading together, it's such a weird blending of worlds.
Yes.
And then, I mean, this may be sort of, you know, mundane, but like every date night, Kevin and I are finding like all we're talking about is the church and the staff.
Yes.
And we need to have this
Oh,
conversation.
man.
And then we're like, okay, just stop. Just talk about something else. How are the kids?
Yes.
And inevitably it just goes, you know?
Yes.
And so, yeah, to have that marriage counselor to help you kind of
Yes.
navigate the world is really, really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, it's almost a cliche now to say this, but ministry has been quite brutal, I would say, especially over the past few years.
Yeah.
I was reading somewhere that it might have been Henry Nouwen. It might not have been, so I hate to say, I'll just say C.S. Lewis, because everything is C.S. Lewis in Christianity. But ministry is a series of ungrieved losses. I just read that somewhere. Talk to me just about how you two personally have navigated the pain of leadership in general, but especially over the past few years.
Yeah. You want me to share first? So when the pandemic hit, and, you know, my initial response to that was very much the anxiety of, we are a church that's a year and a half old. We've never done online. Are we going to survive this? Are all our people going to go to a church that's already been doing online for years, and it's just a seamless, you know, switch for them?
Right.
And so that was my initial response, was just that fear of, are we going to survive this as a church plant? But then as we entered a lot of the, you know, racial division that was happening in our country, and entering into those conversations and engaging those conversations, and finding out that our people were not interested in talking about race, were angry.
I will say most of them were.
Most of them
some
were
of them
open
were
to
not.
it, but
Okay,
some
but some
were,
weren't. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at
so,
least what we found, those that aren't are like vehemently opposed to it. It's not just a neutrality. It's like, we should not talk about this.
Well, and it was we shouldn't talk about it, but it was also the things that I learned through that process. I mean, for us to have a conversation where we're acknowledging the pain of Black people in America, I did not know going into that conversation that the correlation of that is you are anti-police.
Right.
Like
right.
that was kind of the way that was read. And so finding ourselves in a lot of conversations with people where really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to manage their feelings. I'm trying to manage their emotions, their anxieties, their fears. And long story short, I just, by the August of 2020, just found myself emotionally exhausted because I was trying to really manage the feelings and reactions of everybody in our church, both to the pandemic, to racial division, to political division as we headed into the election.
Right.
And so where I'm going with all of this is, and this kind of gets into my story a little bit, but as I took a month off and just processed and worked through why was this so hard? Why was this so difficult? And as I leaned into, I'm a child of an alcoholic, so my family, there was alcoholism in my family, and learning kind of how that has impacted me as an adult, I realized that I had taken my codependency of my childhood and towards my father, of kind of codependency is this sense where you feel this need to manage everybody's feelings and emotions and reactions in order to keep them happy. Because if they're happy, you're safe, is kind of the mentality. And so I had just taken that codependency and transferred it to my church and said, how do I keep everybody happy? How do I make sure everybody's emotions are okay? And if I can just have a conversation with you, I can make this okay. And realizing I couldn't do that. I couldn't control everybody's feelings and emotions. And so that was a big part of me beginning the process of understanding, what was the impact of my childhood as a child of an alcoholic? How does that impact me as a leader? And how do I work to make this sustainable? Because this isn't sustainable right now. So
I want to have you unpack more of that, Ike, in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But I want to kind of use that to transition to your book, Sharon, because that's a lot of what you're writing about. The title of your book is The Cost of Control, Why We Crave It, the Anxiety It Gives Us, and the Real Power God Promises. Were you writing because of what you were seeing in your church leadership, or how did your book kind of play into what Ike's talking about?
The Nothing is Wasted content library of resources and podcast episodes are made possible by our growing community of members. If you would like to be a part of having a global impact and help people partner with God to take back their stories, consider joining Community Plus for just $20 a month. Your membership comes with access to a course called Position for Redemption, master classes taught by our certified coaches, bonus podcast episodes, and Q&As with myself and some of our other special guests. You can get more information and sign up at nothingiswasted.com/community. I look forward to connecting with you further within our Community Plus platform.
So the inspiration for the book came more from seeing how people in our church were responding to the pandemic. It was not initially inspired by my own interior world, but seeing how when everything shut down, everyone was taking all their fears, all their control issues kind of to the internet instead of to God. Or there was also this, like, we're already a hyper individualistic culture, but there was this push deeper into this hyper autonomy because we had lost control over so much that there was very much on the left and the right, very much this no one can tell me what to do kind of mentality. And all of this was about control. And so I could see there was very much this problem of control that was malforming our people. But I also really believe that my best teaching comes from conviction over my own sin. And so at some point, as I was processing all this, I thought, well, I'm seeing this control idol and so many people, like, is it also in me? Because I did not think I struggled with control. And if I said that to Ike like 3 years ago, you'd been like, okay.
I got that.
That's really precious that like you think that. But yeah, realized I do struggle with control, but I was not, when I thought of control and leadership, I thought of leaders who are controlling, who are,
domineering
leading,
and
like intimidating, creating a culture of fear, that sort of a thing, which is not either one of us. But I started to realize that control plays out in a lot of different ways. And at ground zero of sin entering the world, that original will to control, what they actually reached for was not power, but knowledge. And realizing that for me, that's one of the primary ways that I try to control people is with knowledge. And so the way that I was responding, whereas Ike was trying to sort of manage people's emotions whenever we were making decisions that we knew were going to be unpopular or disappoint people, I thought, well, if we just give them all the data, if we just explain to them, this is the scripture that is guiding us. These are the experts in our church that we are talking, we had an actual infectious disease expert in our church.
Oh, wow.
And so we're listening to experts, we're consulting other pastors. And if I just lay all this information out and present it to them, then I can change their minds. Right. And that is an overestimation of the power of knowledge, that it can do more than it actually can. And it was a control response. Wow. And what I learned through this process is that control, it's not just that we don't have control over people, but that it always costs us. Whenever we try to control anything that God has not given, it always costs us. It can cost our mental health. And that's what ended up happening when I was thinking, what if I said it this way? What if I said it this way? What if I said it this way? What if I made this airtight argument? Yeah. And what that led to was me laying awake at night, just, anxiety running through this. But it also would strain my relationship with people because people don't want to be pushed. They can feel when you're pushing them. Right. And so it doesn't work, and the collateral damage is actually even worse. And so that was how we were responding, somewhat differently. But for both of us, I think there was a control piece. Overestimating, thinking we had more control over people than we actually had. Wow. And not in a controlling way. It was genuinely wanting to love them and serve them well. Yeah. But because we overestimated our influence, it cost our mental health pretty severely. And it probably unnecessarily hindered our relationship with people as well.
Wow. And at what point in the journey did you kind of realize this is happening? And then what steps did you take, I guess, to begin to sort of let go of the control?
You want to answer first?
No, you go ahead.
I think with people in our church, once I made that connection about the cost of control, that put everything in a different light.
Wow.
Because I've been a Christian most of my life, and so I've always known you shouldn't try to control people. Yeah. But knowing that you shouldn't control was never helpful to me.
That does nothing for me.
Yeah, in the middle of it, because you also think, I know what's best. I'm doing this for a good reason. And if I can just
I'm a leader.
Right.
Yeah. I need to lead people through this.
Yeah, and I think too the thing about leadership is lots of times you're the leader because you're actually good at convincing people. You are good at getting your way. Wow. Honestly. Yeah. And so I was I'm just a really good debater. That's kind of how I saw it.
This is how God made me.
Yeah. And so but knowing that I shouldn't, or that I should just surrender or let go and let God, in terms of motivating me to actually stop controlling, it was a zero. It didn't help me at all. Yeah. But once I realized that moment in Genesis 3, whenever we're reaching for control to soothe our anxieties or to set us free, to rescue us in some way, we are reenacting that moment in Genesis 3, but we're also reenacting its consequences. And we can't get out of that. That is written into the blueprint of creation, of our broken creation now. And so there's no loopholes there. It just is. And you have to accept it. And so once I realized, okay, even if I don't see the cost right now, it's there. It's there.
Yeah.
That totally reframed thinking through when I realized I'm starting to push this person, that I need to back off immediately. And so I could see that right away, but I'll be honest and confess that where I was much slower to see this dynamic happening, and I probably didn't fully appreciate it until maybe 6 months ago, was in our marriage.
I was going to ask you about that, actually. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so we make a lot sometimes decisions together.
Yeah.
And we don't always agree. You know, I don't know if you
Shocker.
relate. Yeah, sometimes
No,
we
I
don't
always agree with my husband constantly.
And so we would disagree about, directions of the church. And these are this isn't just a disagreement about where we're going to go have dinner. This is the direction of our church.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake.
And so we both feel very passionately, and I probably could have been a lawyer. Like, I'm very, very verbally strong. That's another form of control for me is words.
Wow.
And Ike is much more of an internal processor, but he's also just like a better person.
I don't even know what that means.
You just love me really well, and so you'll for the sake of it, you will choose the relationship. Like, if we're disagreeing, you will choose the relationship. And I think I saw it because we weren't yelling at each other, we weren't threatening each other, we weren't having major conflict. I thought, I'm just I'm really convincing, whatever it is.
Yes.
But not realizing that every time I was getting my way, essentially, kind of putting Ike into this corner of realizing I can keep pushing back, or it's gonna break the relationship. Ike leads really well that way.
Yeah.
But starting to realize every time I got my way, it was costing our marriage. And not in a really dramatic or obvious way, but it was much more this slow drip of influence over months and months and years of me just getting my way again and again and again.
Yeah.
And it's hard to describe the way that corrodes a relationship, but at some point I finally started to see it. And that was the grace of God. Honestly.
I was just thinking that, praise God for that kindness.
Yeah, because it didn't take anything truly catastrophic. Yeah. But once I realized it, it was very sobering and has also just changed my, when we disagree, it has really changed my perspective in those moments of thinking, is it worth it? The effects that this is going to have on my marriage, is it worth it to get my way? And the answer is never, So that has been really helpful.
Yeah. Well, I think it was, in terms of the way that it was eating at our marriage, is you find yourselves in these moments where you can keep arguing, or you can say, the only way this is going to turn around is if one of us says, okay, you're right. Let's do this. Right?
Yeah.
And so for the sake of disarming the conversation, you kind of have to back away from really communicating about the topic, because it's not taking you in a positive direction. And so I think for us, getting to a place where we could communicate in a way that it didn't become relationship damaging through those conversations.
Yeah. And have you noticed in your marriage, I know, Sharon, you were saying it's just been about 6 months that you kind of come to this realization, but have you noticed some changes even in your dynamic or in your conversation or in your leadership? Have you seen any of the fruits yet of that discovery?
Well, so I took a sabbatical this summer, and one of the things that we joked was that our marriage needed a sabbatical from ministry.
That's so real. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think we, at that point, really started thinking through what does that look like for our marriage not to carry the weight of ministry as much, in terms of, yes, we need to continue to do our jobs and work in ministry, but what does it look like for our marriage to carry less of that? And so honestly, that was kind of some of the restructuring that we were talking about earlier, but it also meant just acknowledging, you know what? The less meetings we're in together, the better. Like the better it is for our marriage,
Yeah.
And so just kind of making some of those intentional decisions of what are the things that we're doing that put weight on our marriage and what needs to change so that we can continue to do ministry in really healthy ways, but also in ways that are beneficial for our marriage.
Yeah, because the other dynamic that has less to do with control, I would say, is just the very subtle way that work has invaded our marriage.
Yes.
And that was also very, very gradual and subtle and kind of under the radar until we realized, oh, we are getting really good at parenting together and leading a church together. But the romance is, kind of taking a back seat.
Yep.
And neither one of us wanted that. And so we've had to figure out how do we put firmer boundaries around our marriage so that work isn't constantly, because we are very good about not talking about work when we're kind of off the clock.
Yeah.
But discovering that if we did have kind of a disagreement in a meeting or something, that would still sort of like follow us home.
Wow.
And we could still be kind of frustrated with one another about that. And so just figuring out how do we limit like the number of times that happens? How do we have boundaries? How do we walk our way out of that?
Well, and with boundaries, I think there are verbal boundaries of we're not going to talk about church during these off times.
Right.
But the thing that I think we realized, and I think we're still trying to figure out though, is that there's a difference between verbal boundaries and emotional boundaries. So we can choose not to talk about work after 5 p.m., but how do we deal with the fact that we still feel the emotions of the workday after 5 p.m.?
Super angry about that thing that happened.
Right, yeah. And so what do we need to do so that it's not just, we tried boundaries and that didn't work, but there's actually some emotional work that has to be done as well.
Yeah, we've had to seek out mentors who, because this feels sort of like uncharted territory a little bit. There just aren't that many people who are doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
But we met, I don't know how many months ago now it's been, but we met with Jarrett and Jeannie Stevens.
I was about to ask if you knew the Stevens. Yep.
Yeah. And they had a really great, and I want to credit them, but also share what they said because it was so helpful to us. They said that whenever there's like a conflict in a meeting, they kind of need like a clearing. And where after the meeting, if one of them is hurt by the other, they'll go and say something to the effect of, when this happened, this is the story that I wrote about what you just said and what you meant and giving that's like a very it's not overly direct, saying you did this, but this is what I heard, this is the story that I wrote about it, and then giving the person the opportunity to correct and say that's not at all, but also to apologize. And so we have really needed wise counsel from people like them, and they are very wise.
So helpful. Jeannie is she gave me the courage to co-plant with Kevin. I was really a little bit like you, Sharon. Like I'm not sure if I want to do this, number one, and I'm not sure if I can. And I sat in her office and she was like, just like be brave. And I just really, there's a lot more wisdom than that, but I really appreciate Jeannie and Jarrett. I think they're fantastic. Sharon, you posted this on social media, but then it's also in your book. You said we can be in control or we can be in community, but we can't be both. I hear some of that as you're talking about even your relationship dynamic. To be in control means you're not choosing community with your husband. Unpack that for, our listeners who feel that kind of need to grasp onto control.
Yeah, so in the book, I look at different ways that we try to exert control or feel in control of our lives. And the ones that we tend to think of most, especially, is power. That's the number one that we kind of associate with control. But there's a lot. I already mentioned knowledge is a really big one. I talk about money. I talk about shame. Like, shame is a really easy way to control other people. Yeah. But one of the ones that I also talk about is autonomy. And I already mentioned this, that we are in this hyper individualistic culture. We are an anti-authority culture. Yeah. We really emphasize personal rights, absolute autonomy, all of that. And to some extent, that is good and God-given. You know, when you look at Genesis 1 and 2, you see that Adam and Eve have freedom. You know, they are not micromanaged by God. Yeah. And so there is some autonomy that's healthy, especially as we're in this moment of reckoning with religious authorities, or really any sort of, in Hollywood, whatever it is, where authorities have abused their power. And one of the ways that authorities do that is by saying, don't listen to your gut. Don't listen to your intuition. Wow. You know, the heart is deceitful. You know, all of that. Right. Listen to me. Yeah. That kind of thing. And so it's a helpful corrective to say, you need to listen to your intuition. Like, if this something feels off, like, you need to listen to that. However, we are seeing this overcorrection, and some of this was already there because of our very, very individualistic culture, where people don't want anyone telling them what to do. Right. And that was very much what we saw in the pandemic. And that was something that we experienced as well, when we would say, you know, we've sought wise counsel, we've talked to experts, we believe that this is the wisest way forward as a church. And most people were on board, but some people were like, I don't care what you think. Like, I don't agree with that. Right. And it didn't matter that we were the pastor. It didn't matter that we were an authority over them. Yeah. And that is where it starts to unravel, because God's vision for community, we see it in 1 Corinthians 12, is this interdependent body where we must rely on one another, and that what affects one part of the body affects all of the body. Right. And when we overemphasize autonomy, what happens is just everyone wants to be the head. Yep. And the head is Christ. First of all, the head is Christ.
Right. Not me.
But everyone wants to be the head, which is just a monster, basically. You know, a body with like 1,000 heads is just a monster. But it's not community either. Yeah, and so that's something that I think we need the language for, as we, on the one hand, pastors must take seriously the ways that churches have hurt people, the ways that pastors have abused their authority. Yeah. We need to be really compassionate towards that, but we also need to use a language that makes community, that makes sense again, basically, for a, you know, anti-authority, hyper-individualistic culture. Yeah. And I think this is one important way to talk about it, is that you can have control. No one can tell you what to do, but community cannot exist that way. And so you have to choose between one or the other.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good, Sharon. Such a wise word for all of us. Ike, I want to kind of transition back to you and some of the things you were talking about earlier with your childhood trauma. Yeah. Would love to just, especially for our listeners that are in pain themselves, or maybe have childhood trauma, I would love to just hear your story. But then also, Sharon, to get you kind of thinking ahead, like, how do spouses help support spouses who are, you know, children of alcoholics or children of trauma or whatever? So, Ike, maybe you can start, and then Sharon, as you're thinking about ways to support, that would be helpful to hear too.
Yeah, I mean, connecting to the control conversation, I think for me, it wasn't so much the concern. I mean, I was concerned about the relationships, but as a pastor, knowing I had a responsibility to our whole church and to stay as healthy as possible to lead our church, my bigger concern, honestly, was how is this attempt at trying to control all of the dynamics that seem uncontrollable during the pandemic actually deteriorate my interior world, and how is it pulling that apart, and how is it making it unsustainable to do ministry? And so that was what sent me on a journey of kind of investigating, understanding how do we understand what's going on in our interior world. And I had done some study and some reading on being what's called an adult child of an alcoholic. It's someone who grew up in a context where there was a alcoholic parent or a primary adult figure that was an alcoholic. And years ago, I had read some stuff, and there was a book simply called Adult Children of Alcoholics that in this listed 12 common characteristics of adult children of alcoholics. And so it was things like adult children of alcoholics lie when it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make things any better.
Wow.
Never feel like they're normal. They are either super responsible or super irresponsible. They take themselves very seriously. There was this 12 things. And I had read that before. And I remember the first time I read it thinking, oh my goodness, this is me to a T, first of all. But second of all, not everybody's this way. Like, this isn't everybody.
Like, you know? This, not like other people around me aren't operating.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so during the pandemic, I kind of went back to some of that stuff because I was realizing I need to understand this a little bit deeper. And so, as I looked at one of the things that I struggled with was kind of my fear of failure. Like, I'm going to fail at this church planting thing and because of this. And so why does that matter so much? And this feeling of need to manage my image and manage my reputation. And growing up in a context where the only lie that you never really exposed or that you never really talked about was the main lie, which is our family's okay. Right? Like, you didn't acknowledge that things were not okay. And so there were lots of lies that were okay because it got you around that one lie, which was the family wasn't okay.
Wow.
And so when I looked at situations like our church being divided, for example, I realized I would tell one kind of camp one thing, and then I would tell another camp something that wasn't the exact opposite, but
a little nuanced.
Yes, exactly. To kind of color things in a way that everybody would be happy with me, because that's what I did growing up. I was like, how do I keep the peace? How do I keep everybody happy?
Wow.
And what I realized was, if these two camps start talking to each other, they're going to be like, well, that's not what Ike told me. That's not what the pastor said to me. And I had this moment of like, I don't know who I am, honestly. Like, I don't know who I am apart from my value to these people and my value as a pastor, to make this thing work. And so that forced me to begin doing some real interior work of understanding that a lot of my anxiety in ministry was driven by, how do I make this go well? How do I control all the aspects of this event? How do I, make this a great event? And it was just tearing me apart. And so I was like, man, am I just a bad leader because of the childhood I grew up in? Like, is that making me a bad leader? And I wrestled with that for a little while, but then I began to lean into realizing, there are also some really good things that my childhood put in me that prepared me for leadership. For example, as a child growing up in a traumatic kind of environment where, there's abuse or there's alcoholism or any kind of dysfunction like that, you learn to read a room really well. You learn to read the emotions. You read facial expressions and to understand, okay, am I safe? Am I okay? Do I need to get out of here? Do I need to get my siblings out of here? What's the context I'm in and what do I need to do? And I realized that, Sharon was talking earlier just about kind of my kind of managing our team and kind of managing people's emotions, and realizing that can be bad and that can be hard, but that also can be really good, to the point where you're sitting in a team meeting and you can feel the room getting tense, right? And it's getting kind of emotionally, spun up a little bit.
Yeah.
Being able to read that, you can be able to step into that moment and say, hey, I can sense that this room is getting a little tense right now. I think we need to just take a moment, take a break. Let's break for a few minutes. And so realizing that as much as my childhood had been an obstacle to leadership, it had also prepared me for leadership.
Interesting.
And so kind of then beginning the work of exploring, how do I learn to leverage that stuff more? And so that's kind of been the journey that I've been on for a while. Yeah.
That's so interesting because not all leaders can do that, can sense the emotion in the room. And so to think of that as, of course, both a gift of your pain. I guess that's the way to think about it. A treasure in the darkness. That's interesting to reframe it like that. I'm guessing a lot of our listeners can relate to that and probably feel a lot of hope hearing you say that.
Yeah.
So Sharon, I saw you kind of like, he's naming some things, the lying for no reason. Your face kind of like smirks a little bit, like you're kind of going, yes. I know you're not, I know you love your husband. You're not like being condescending or anything like that. That's all recognition of like, yep, I saw that. Yep, I saw that. What word, I guess, do you have to spouses walking with their partners, or even, parents walking with kids, or friends walking with friends who they might notice some of these tendencies?
Yeah. So at the beginning of the book, I use this phrase that is not original to me, but it says, when you name it, you tame it. And we have really found that to be true in understanding what it means for Ike to be an adult child of an alcoholic. The more that he has been able to name, well, this is why I struggle with this, and this is actually what's going on, that has been so clarifying, because otherwise there have been times where, like, a really interesting example is the way you like secretly eat ice cream.
This is a very innocent example, but it gets to the point very quickly.
So for like years and years and years, this goes to the like lying when it like doesn't matter, or like hiding when it doesn't matter. For years and years in our marriage, I would have this joke about how Ike would stealth eat our ice cream, how we would have ice cream in the freezer, and I would come home one day and think like, oh, we've got ice cream, I'm gonna go get some ice cream, and I would go well, it wouldn't be gone. There would be like
there'd be one spoon left, one spoonful left. Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to interrupt you, but this is literally our marriage dynamic. My husband is a secret ice cream eater, and so I'm dying of laughter on the inside because I know exactly what you're talking about. You go to get it, and it's like, you're like, wait, I thought
why
anyway,
did you just
go ahead.
finish the ice cream? Because then, like, I would have seen there was no ice cream left, and I would have adjusted all my expectations to like not want ice cream,
not have ice cream.
The carton with one single scoop, like not an ice cream scoop, like a spoon scoop, like a bite of ice cream.
A bite of ice cream.
Yeah, and so
because you didn't want to eat the whole thing.
That's right.
And so, but I would joke because I would never see him eat the ice cream.
Yeah.
And so I was like, when are you even doing this? And I think we were married for 10 years before you admitted that you were actually doing it, like, in secret, kind of. Like, what was your, like, reason?
I think that there was a shame response in there somewhere.
Yeah, of course.
I feel like it's I don't know. I can't remember now. We broke it down and kind of got to the heart of it, but there was very much a sense of like, well, if you don't see me do it, then I don't actually do it.
It doesn't actually happen.
It doesn't actually happen.
But it wasn't like I was going, if I saw him eating ice cream, I wasn't going to be like,
right. You're like
I would have judged him. And so it was like this random like shame response for no reason. And so that has played out in higher stakes, where not when, he's failed in some way, or, the impulse being to hide it. But what has been really helpful is not just naming those things that is normal. Like he said, I don't know what normal is. And so to be able to say, no, this actually is normal, like based on the childhood that you had. But it has also been really helpful for me in terms of understanding him and having compassion for why he responds. Because otherwise, there are things that if you grew up in a dysfunctional home, it makes total sense why you would now respond XYZ to certain situations. Makes total sense. But if you don't name that, you don't know, then it's like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you responding this way in this situation? And so that removes so much shame when you're able to say, of course you would respond this way. And so that has been really helpful for me. And I've been really fortunate because Ike has done that work. Yes. And done like a ton of reading, and then he's been able to like verbalize it to me. But if you are married to someone who maybe you know that is your spouse's background and they haven't come to that, you know, you might have to do some of that work on your own and do some of your own reading. And there are books for loved ones of, you know, children, probably of adult children of alcoholics. There's, do you remember the name of the one book?
There's one called Loving Your Adult Child of an Alcoholic.
Yeah, because it really is. I mean, one of the things that most concerns me is when I see a leader who has not named this and is underestimating the ways. If you have not dealt with this, it will deal with you, and it will influence your leadership. You think it's not. You think you just, like, one thing that Ike says that I think is like exactly right is just because you bury it doesn't mean it's dead. And I think a lot of like adult children of alcoholics or who grew up in dysfunctional homes, they know how to soldier on, and they know how to just like keep going, and they know how to be the hero. And they don't realize that their childhood is actually leading them and influencing them in ways. And so I would, for anyone who's listening where that is your background and you haven't worked through it, I would really plead with you to do that work, because it's going to come home to roost sooner or later. And I'm just very, very grateful that Ike has taken it seriously and done that work.
Well, and I would say too, you know, to any listeners that are identifying with this too, is this work, I think we tend to avoid it because it means I have to admit things about myself. I have to acknowledge things, and that's hard. But I think what you also discover on that journey is that there's actually really good things packed in there, things in your life that have been put in you because of your experiences that can actually help your relationships, that can prepare you for healthy relationships. And you won't find that unless you do that work. And so it actually is to great benefit to your relationships and to just your own well-being to do that work and discover some things that you wouldn't have discovered if you hadn't dug into them.
I'm so grateful for both of you just sitting here listening to the way you're leading from that interior health, and the way you're continuing to dive into, be curious even about your own pain and your own past. And yet God, I mean, it's so clear God is bringing wholeness and healing in you, in your marriage, through your ministry. And so I have been so blessed just sitting here listening to you guys talk about the interior work you're doing. So thank you for that. And thank you for being so honest with us. Really, really appreciate it. Yeah. Sometimes I mean, and I know you know this, but sometimes you get leaders who are on the other side, and that's wonderful. But it's nice to hear people who are in the middle of processing it, you know, being and becoming more and more like Jesus in the journey. It's really encouraging for me to hear. So appreciate both of you. Where can our listeners connect with you? Sharon, where can they find your book? Ike, where can they find out about the book that you're working on, that kind of thing?
So The Cost of Control is available anywhere books are sold. So the easiest is Amazon. And then I'm most active on Instagram, just Sharon H. Miller.
Yeah, and I'm on Twitter, Instagram at Ike F. Miller. And then the book that is coming out in September, so we got a little bit of a time, but the book is called Good Baggage: How Your Difficult Childhood Prepared You for Healthy Relationships. And so that'll be available kind of wherever books are sold, but excited to get that message out there and share
it's gonna be
kind of
great.
The things that I've learned. Yeah.
Appreciate both of you so much. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.